Berlin, May 1945. The air is thick with the smell of smoke and wet concrete. The thousand-year Reich has collapsed in just 12 years. Soldiers from the East, the Soviets, and the West, Americans and British, shake hands at the Elbe River. They are smiling, but the smiles don't reach their eyes. They are no longer allies. They are the only two people left in the room, and they both want to rearrange the furniture. The conflict of ideals. To understand the next 45 years, you have to understand the big two philosophies. The American dream, capitalism and democracy. The belief that the individual should be free to own property and vote for their leaders. The Soviet vision, communism and central planning. The belief that the state should control resources to ensure equality, born from a history of being invaded by the West. The salami tactics. Joseph Stalin begins what historians call salami tactics. He doesn't take Eastern Europe all at once. He slices it like a salami. In Poland, Bulgaria, and Romania, he slowly removes opposition leaders, rigs elections, and installs puppet governments. In 1946, Winston Churchill stands on a stage in Missouri, USA, and utters the words that define an era. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. The first test, the Berlin airlift, 1948. Berlin is the focal point. The city is deep inside the Soviet-controlled part of Germany, but the city itself is split. Stalin wants the West out. He shuts down every road, every rail line, and every canal leading into West Berlin. He wants to starve the city into submission. The world waits for World War III, but the U.S. President, Harry Truman, chooses a different path. The operation. For 11 months, a plane lands in West Berlin every 45 seconds. The cargo, milk, flour, coal, and even candy for the children, dropped via tiny parachutes by the candy bomber. The result, Stalin realizes he cannot stop the planes without starting a nuclear war. He lifts the blockade. The West has won the first battle without firing a single shot. The shift, 1949. Two massive events happen in 1949 that change the game forever. NATO is formed. The West creates a military alliance. An attack on one is an attack on all. The Soviet spark. In the remote deserts of Kazakhstan, the USSR detonates their first atomic bomb. The American nuclear monopoly is over. The Cold War is no longer just about politics. It is now a race to see who can build enough bombs to destroy the world first. The Korean Peninsula, 1950. The world's attention shifts to a small peninsula in Asia. Divided after World War II at the 38th parallel, North Korea, backed by Stalin, launches a massive surprise invasion of the South. For the United States, this is the ultimate test of containment. If South Korea falls, who is next? The war. It is a seesaw of brutality. UN forces push the North back almost to the Chinese border. Then, hundreds of thousands of Chinese volunteers flood across the river, pushing the West back down. The result? After 3 years and millions of deaths, an armistice is signed. The border ends up almost exactly where it started. The lesson? This is a proxy war. The superpowers fight through proxies, North versus South, to avoid a direct nuclear exchange between Washington and Moscow. The enemy within, the Red Scare. While soldiers fight in Korea, a different kind of war is fought at home. In America, the fear of the Red Menace reaches a peak fever. Senator Joseph McCarthy, he claims to have a list of hundreds of communists working inside the U.S. government. The atmosphere, neighbors suspect neighbors, careers are ruined by blacklists. To be accused of being a commie was a social death sentence. The Soviet side, Behind the Iron Curtain, the paranoia is even worse. Stalin's secret police, the NKVD, purge anyone suspected of Western sympathies, sending thousands to the Gulag labor camps. 1953, the year the world changed. Two massive shifts happen in 1953. The death of Stalin. The man of steel dies. His successor, Nikita Khrushchev, eventually shocks the world by denouncing Stalin's crimes. He talks of peaceful coexistence. The hydrogen bomb. Both sides now possess the H-bomb. These aren't just bigger bombs, they are thousands of times more powerful than the Hiroshima blast. Mad, mutually assured destruction becomes the new reality. If you shoot, you die too. The crushing of Hungary, 1956. Khrushchev's talk of peace is put to the test when the people of Hungary revolt against their Soviet-backed government. They want freedom and the removal of Soviet troops. For a moment, it looks like they might win, but the Soviets cannot allow a hole in the Iron Curtain. They send in the tanks. 2,500 Hungarians are killed, and the West does nothing but watch. Why? Because intervening meant World War III. The race to the heavens, 1957. The Cold War leaves the atmosphere. On October 4th, 1957, the USSR launches Sputnik 1, the first man-made satellite. The panic. To the West, this wasn't a scientific victory. It was a military threat. If a Soviet rocket could carry a satellite into space, it could carry a nuclear warhead to New York in 30 minutes. The response: the US creates NASA and pours billions into science and education. The space race had begun, and the finish line was the moon. The Berlin Wall, 1961. By 1961, the Cold War had a problem: West Berlin. It was a glittering advertisement for capitalism sitting right in the middle of communist East Germany. Thousands of people were fleeing the East every day to find better lives in the West. The Midnight Construction. On the night of August 12, 1961, East German soldiers began laying barbed wire in concrete blocks. The result? Families were split in half. People who went to sleep in one country woke up unable to visit their parents or jobs across the street. This symbol, the Antifaschistischer Schutzwall, or Anti-Fascist Protection Rampart, became the ultimate symbol of the Cold War, a wall built not to keep enemies out, but to keep its own people in. The Caribbean Crisis, Cuba. In 1959, a young revolutionary named Fidel Castro took power in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. When he aligned with the Soviet Union, the Americans panicked. After a failed US-backed invasion at the Bay of Pigs, the Soviets saw an opportunity to protect their new ally and balance the scales of power. October 1962, the 13 days. An American U-2 spy plane flying high over Cuba snaps a photo that changes history. Soviet nuclear missile sites are being built. They are close enough to strike Washington, D.C. in minutes. The blockade. President John F. Kennedy goes on national television. He doesn't order an invasion, which would start World War III. Instead, he orders a naval quarantine around Cuba. The standoff. Soviet ships carrying more missiles steam toward the U.S. Navy line. Around the world, B-52 bombers are kept in the air armed with nukes. Families in America and Russia begin stocking basements with food, believing the end is coming. The secret telegrams. Behind the scenes, Kennedy and Khrushchev are communicating frantically. Neither wants to be the leader who destroyed the world, but neither can afford to look weak. The resolution. A deal is struck in the shadows. Publicly, the USSR will remove the missiles from Cuba if the US promises never to invade the island. Secretly, the US agrees to remove its own nuclear missiles from Turkey, which were aimed at Moscow. The ships turn around. the world breathes again. The aftermath, a lesson learned. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a near-death experience for humanity. It led to the hotline, a direct teletype link between the White House and the Kremlin so the leaders could talk instantly instead of waiting hours for telegrams to be translated. The Limited Test Ban Treaty. Both sides agree to stop testing nuclear weapons in the atmosphere or underwater. The leaders realized that while they were enemies, they shared one common goal: survival. The Jungle Trap, Vietnam. While the U.S. had been sending advisors to South Vietnam for years, 1964 marked a massive escalation. Under President Lyndon B. Johnson, the U.S. committed hundreds of thousands of troops to stop the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. The Proxy War. North Vietnam was supported by the USSR and China with weapons and supplies, while the U.S. fought a grueling guerrilla war against the Viet Cong. The domestic toll. This was the first televised war. For the first time, people saw the horror of combat in their living rooms. Protests erupted across America, tearing the country apart. The exit. In 1975, the world watched as helicopters evacuated the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. Vietnam was unified under communism. It was a massive blow to the American policy of containment. A breath of fresh air. Détente. Exhausted by the Vietnam War and internal social unrest, the U.S. sought to lower the temperature. This period is known as détente, a French word meaning relaxation. Nixon goes to China, 1972. In a brilliant diplomatic move, President Richard Nixon visited Beijing. By befriending China, he forced the Soviets to be more cooperative, fearing they would be left out. SALT II. The U.S. and USSR signed the Strategic Arms Limitations Talks Treaty. This was the first time both sides agreed to actually limit the number of nuclear missiles they owned. The Apollo-Soyuz mission. In 1975, an American spacecraft docked with a Soviet one in orbit. The astronauts and cosmonauts shook hands in space, a symbol that perhaps the two giants could work together. The Great Betrayal, Afghanistan, 1979. Détente came to a crashing halt in December 1979. The Soviet Union, fearing the collapse of a communist government on its border, invaded Afghanistan. The Soviet Vietnam. Much like the U.S. in Vietnam, the Soviets found themselves trapped. They fought a fierce resistance of Islamic fighters known as the Mujahideen. The U.S. reaction. The U.S. was outraged. They began secretly funneling weapons and money to the Mujahideen, including high-tech Stinger missiles to shoot down Soviet helicopters. The boycott. To protest the invasion, the U.S. led a boycott of the 1980 Summer Olympics held in Moscow. The golden era of détente was officially dead. The global chessboard. While the big wars were in Asia, the Cold War was also playing out in Africa and Latin America. From the civil wars in Angola to the dirty wars in South America, every local conflict was treated as a game of influence between Washington and Moscow. The new warrior, Ronald Reagan. In 1981, Ronald Reagan entered the White House with a very different philosophy than his predecessors. He didn't want to just manage the conflict. He wanted to end it by outspending and outcompeting the Soviet Union. The moral stance. In a famous 1983 speech, Reagan labeled the USSR an evil empire. This signaled the end of the polite diplomacy of the 1970s. The Reagan Doctrine. The U.S. began aggressively supporting anti-communist movements worldwide. This included the Contras in Nicaragua and the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, aiming to bleed the Soviets at their borders. The Arms Race 2.0, SDI. The most controversial move was the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, nicknamed Star Wars. The concept, Reagan proposed a space-based system of lasers and satellites that could shoot down Soviet nuclear missiles before they reached the US. The panic in Moscow. This terrified the Soviet leadership. If the US had a shield, the Soviet mutually assured destruction, MAD deterrent, was useless. The USSR, already suffering from a failing economy and the drain of the Afghan war, realized they could not afford to build their own version. The brink of disaster. Able Archer 83. In November 1983, the world almost ended by accident. NATO conducted a massive military exercise called Able Archer 83, which simulated a transition from a conventional war to a nuclear one. The Soviets, already paranoid about Reagan's rhetoric, believed this wasn't a drill. They thought it was a cover for a real surprise attack. They fueled their nuclear bombers and placed their missiles on high alert. It was only after the exercise ended without an attack that the Soviets stood down. This event served as a wake-up call to both sides. The tension was becoming too dangerous to sustain. The dying giant, the Soviet economy. While the US was booming, the Soviet Union was crumbling from within. Stagnation. The central planning system was failing. Store shelves were empty, and the black market was the only place to find basic goods. The cost of empire. The USSR was spending up to 25% of its GDP on the military, leaving almost nothing for its citizens. The turning point, 1985. In March 1985, a new kind of leader rose to power in the Kremlin, Mikhail Gorbachev. He was younger, more energetic, and he realized that if the Soviet Union didn't change, it would collapse. He was ready to talk, but the world didn't know yet that these talks would lead to the end of the world as they knew it. The Reformer, Mikhail Gorbachev. By 1986, the Soviet Union was a house of cards. Mikhail Gorbachev knew he couldn't keep up with American spending, so he introduced two revolutionary concepts to save the system: glasnost, openness. For the first time, Soviet citizens were allowed to criticize the government and read banned books. Perestroika, restructuring, an attempt to introduce some private ownership and move away from total government control of the economy. The spark. 1989, the year of miracles. Gorbachev made one more crucial decision. He told the communist leaders of Eastern Europe that if their people revolted, the Soviet Red Army would not come to save them. The dominoes fell instantly. Poland, the trade union Solidarity won a landslide victory in free elections. Hungary, the government literally cut the barbed wire fence on the border with Austria. The miracle. In country after country, peaceful protesters took to the streets. The communist regimes, realizing they were alone, simply stepped aside. The night the world changed, November 9th, 1989. In East Germany, protests had reached a boiling point. A government official, Günter Schabowski, was given a note about new, easier travel rules. During a live press conference, he was asked when the rules took effect. He hesitated, checked his notes, and said, "As far as I know, immediately, without delay." Thousands of East Berliners rushed to the checkpoints at the Berlin Wall. The guards, confused and having received no orders to shoot, eventually opened the gates. The celebration. People from east and west embraced on top of the wall. They attacked the concrete with hammers and chisels. The symbol of division was being turned into souvenirs. The final collapse, 1991. Once the satellite states were gone, the Soviet Union itself began to splinter. Republics like Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia declared independence. The coup. Hardline communists tried to seize power from Gorbachev in August 1991 to stop the collapse, but the Russian people, led by Boris Yeltsin, stood in front of the tanks and refused to move. The coup failed. The end. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned. The Soviet flag, the hammer and sickle, was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time and replaced with the tricolor flag of the Russian Federation. The legacy. The Cold War ended without the nuclear Big Bang everyone had feared for 40 years. It left behind a world where the United States was the sole superpower, but it also left a complicated map of new nations and old ethnic tensions that continue to shape our world today.